You know the image. A bronzed warrior, crimson cape snapping in the wind, jaw like carved stone, standing tall at the mouth of a narrow pass, eyes burning with righteous fury, 300 brothers at his back, holding the line against an empire. You've seen the movie, you've heard the speech, you've seen the comic book panel burned into the walls of every gym and military barracks on the planet, and almost all of it is a lie. Not just a simplification, not just Hollywood drama, a fundamental, deep-rooted lie. One that was engineered to hide something far more disturbing than a Persian army of 1 million men. The real Leonidas was not a freedom fighter. He was not a noble king standing for democracy, for liberty, for the rights of the common man. He was a product of a society so savage, so psychologically brutal, that it makes most modern prison systems look like summer camps. He was born into a political house soaked in royal blood, madness and conspiracy. He ascended a throne of knives. He ruled over an economy built entirely on the backs of enslaved human beings, hundreds of thousands of them, who he was legally empowered to have murdered without trial, without cause, without consequence. To the Helot who tilled the fields of Laconia in terror every single night, Leonidas was not a hero. He was the monster in the dark. And at Thermopylae, that legendary last stand you've been romanticizing your entire life, strip away the slow-motion cinematography, the Hans Zimmer soundtrack, the abs, and what you find is a coldly calculated military sacrifice, ordered by a man who understood, with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a machine, that 300 men needed to die so that thousands more could live to fight another day. There was no glory in it. There was only math. Brutal, blood-soaked math. Tonight, we go behind the myth. We go into the brutal reality of the Agoge, the childhood factory that ground boys into weapons. We descend into the snake pit of Spartan royal politics. We walk the blood-soaked corridors of power where Leonidas clawed his way to the throne. We face the screaming horror of what it meant to be a Helot under Spartan rule. And finally, we stand at Thermopylae and watch a king die, not in slow motion, but in the grim, desperate, howling chaos of real ancient warfare. This is the story they didn't tell you. This is the story of the real Leonidas, and it is far more terrifying than any myth. Before we go any further, if you're new to this channel, Wars in History is where we strip the mythology from the bloodiest chapters of human civilization and show you the raw, unfiltered truth. No fairy tales, no censorship, just history, the way it actually happened. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell, because this is a 2-hour deep dive, and we're only just getting started. And if you already know what this channel's about, drop a comment below. Tell me, did you think you already knew the real Leonidas? Because by the end of this documentary, I promise you, you won't. Let's begin. The year is 480 BC. The Persian Empire, the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen, is marching south through Greece. City after city is falling, burning, surrendering without a fight. At the head of this unstoppable tide stands Xerxes I, king of kings, commanding an army that ancient sources claimed numbered over 2 million men, a figure modern historians have scaled back to somewhere between 70,000 and 300,000, but staggering nonetheless. The Greeks, fractured, terrified, and politically divided, are struggling to mount any kind of coherent resistance, and into that chaos steps one man, a Spartan king named Leonidas. What happens next at a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae has become one of the most mythologized moments in all of human history. 300 Spartan warriors standing against an empire. A last stand that has been retold, repackaged, and romanticized for over 2,500 years. In poems, in novels, in Hollywood blockbusters, in motivational speeches and tattooed across the chests of soldiers from 100 different nations. The image of Leonidas has become a universal symbol of defiance, courage, and the righteous few standing against the tyrannical many. It is a powerful story. It is also, in nearly every emotionally resonant detail, a deliberate fiction. Here is what the myth never tells you. Leonidas was not defending democracy. Sparta was one of the most rigidly anti-democratic, brutally hierarchical societies in the ancient world. He was not fighting for freedom. He ruled over one of the largest enslaved populations in Greek history, a captive people called Helots, who outnumbered their Spartan masters by as many as 7-1, and who lived under a permanent, institutionalized reign of terror. He was not even the obvious heir to his throne. Leonidas was the third son of King Anaxandridas II, a spare, not an heir, who clawed his way to power through a succession crisis soaked in madness, exile, and mysterious death. The real Leonidas was born into a society that had made psychological destruction into an art form. From around the age of 7, Spartan boys, including royal princes who were not exempt, were fed into a state-controlled training machine called the Agoge, a system designed not to educate children, but to systematically break them and rebuild them as weapons. They were starved, beaten, subjected to ritual humiliation, forced to sleep on reeds they cut themselves with their bare hands, and deliberately exposed to the brutal Greek winters with minimal clothing. Those who could not survive it did not. The Agoge did not produce noble warriors. It produced conditioned killers who had been taught since childhood that pain was irrelevant, that emotion was weakness, and that the state owned their body, their loyalty, and their death. This is the man who led 300 soldiers to Thermopylae. Not a romantic hero, not a defender of liberty, a product of one of history's most efficient and horrifying military conditioning programs, serving a slave state, executing a military strategy built on calculated sacrifice. The oracle at Delphi had already told Sparta what was coming, that either the city would fall, or one of her kings descended from the line of Heracles would die. Leonidas knew the prophecy. He marched anyway, and whether that makes him brave, or whether it makes him the cold instrument of a political machine, willing to spend 300 lives to buy time for a naval battle, is exactly the question we're going to answer tonight. Over the course of this documentary, we're going to trace the full arc of Leonidas's life, from his obscure, brutal childhood as a royal spare, through the blood-drenched politics of the Agiad royal house, through his years ruling a terror state, to the final grim reality of those 3 days at Thermopylae. We are going to use the ancient sources Herodotus, Plutarch, Diodorus, Siculus, and the archaeological and scholarly record to reconstruct not the legend, but the man. What we will find is a figure far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more disturbing than anything Hollywood has ever dared to show you. To understand Leonidas, you must first understand that he was never supposed to be king. He was born the third son of the Agiad king Anaxandridas II, the ruling monarch of Sparta in the late 6th century BC. Behind the heir apparent Cleomenes, and behind his full-blood brother Dorius, Leonidas occupied third position in a succession line that, in all realistic political probability, he would never ascend. The Agiad royal house was one of Sparta's 2 hereditary kingships, a dual monarchy that had persisted for centuries, with both houses tracing their lineages back to the mythological hero Heracles himself. In that world, succession was not merely a matter of family preference. It was a sacred, politically explosive, and sometimes violently contested institutional question. Leonidas, in that equation, was simply a spare, a reserve unit to be kept alive until the main line succeeded, and then largely forgotten. The circumstances surrounding his birth were already deeply unusual, by Spartan standards, and they cast a long political shadow over everything that followed. His father, Anaxandridas II, had faced a serious dynastic crisis when his first wife, a woman whose name the ancient sources do not preserve, failed to produce children over many years of marriage. The Spartan ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who exercised enormous oversight power over even the kings of Sparta, eventually pressured Anaxandridas to take a second wife simultaneously, a practice that was considered highly irregular and almost unheard of in Spartan social custom. He refused to divorce his first wife, insisting on his loyalty to her. The compromise, taking both women as concurrent wives, resulted in a bizarre domestic arrangement that would have profound dynastic consequences. The second wife quickly bore him a son, Cleomenes, and then, as if to compound the strangeness, The first wife immediately became fertile and bore 3 sons in rapid succession: Dorieus, Leonidas, and Cleombrotus. This left the Agiad house in an extraordinarily complicated position. Sparta now had 4 sons from one king, 1 half-brother designated heir, and 3 full brothers stacked behind him in the succession. In a more mercenary political culture, the obvious solution would have been to quietly eliminate the surplus children. Sparta did not do that. What Sparta did instead was arguably more destructive to the individual. It fed them into the state's machinery of transformation, and let the system decide what they became. The political result was a household defined by barely suppressed rivalry, competing maternal loyalties, and the ever-present awareness among all 4 sons that catastrophe, the death or disgrace of a brother, was the only currency that could advance your position. Leonidas grew up inside that family, understanding from a young age that he existed in the political shadow of other men, and that his survival and relevance depended not on birth order, but on what he could prove in the arena where Sparta measured everything: physical and psychological dominance. Before we can understand what the Agoge did to Leonidas specifically, we need to understand what Sparta was as a society, because the training system did not exist in isolation. It was the most visible expression of a total social contract that differed from every other Greek city-state in fundamental ways. Sparta was not a democracy. It was not a culture of philosophy, art, or commerce in the way that Athens was. It was a garrison state, built around the permanent suppression of a vast enslaved population called Helots, people who had been conquered generations earlier and reduced to agricultural servitude, and who outnumbered their Spartan masters by estimates ranging from 5 to 1 up to as high as 7 to 1. That ratio was not an economic inconvenience. It was an existential terror that shaped every institution Sparta ever built. The Agoge, the military culture, the secret police, the deliberate cultivation of a warrior caste, all of it was ultimately downstream of one terrifying reality. Sparta was a small city permanently surrounded by its own potential revolution, and it kept that revolution at bay through systematic violence and the manufacture of the most efficient soldiers in the ancient world. The Agiad kings were not exempt from that machinery. The firstborn heir of either royal house was excused from the Agoge, a recognition that the primary heir was too politically valuable to risk in a training system that regularly killed its participants. Cleomenes received that exemption. Leonidas did not. At approximately the age of 7, he was removed from his mother's household, separated from his family, and enrolled in the state training program that would define every waking hour of the next 2 decades of his life. This moment, the separation itself, was the first act of deliberate psychological violence the system inflicted. Plutarch records that the intent was explicit: to replace the loyalty a child felt toward his parents and family with an absolute loyalty to the state and to his unit. The family was a competing emotional anchor, and the Agoge's architects understood that soldiers who fought for their mothers would hesitate. Soldiers who fought for their herd, their agilae, would not. The agilae were the foundational units of Agoge life. The word translates roughly as herds or packs, and the choice of language was entirely deliberate. These boys were not students in any recognizable sense. They were managed like livestock, organized into groups under the authority of an older youth called an HEIR, typically a young man in his late teens or early 20s, who had survived enough of the system to be placed in charge of the younger boys. Above the HEIR sat the Paidonomos, a senior magistrate whose title translated bluntly as boy herder. This official was responsible for overseeing the entire program, delegating punishment to mastagophoroi, literally whip-bearers, who carried rods and used them freely on any boy who failed to meet the standard. The organizational structure sent a message that was impossible to misread. You are not a person in this system. You are an asset being processed, and your value is determined entirely by what you can endure and what you can execute on command. The early years of the Agoge, the phase covering boys between approximately 7 and 12 years old, were characterized by deliberate material deprivation. The boys were underfed, not accidentally, not as a result of resource scarcity, but as a calculated institutional policy. The reasoning was explicit in the ancient sources. Hunger sharpened cunning. A starving boy who needed to feed himself and his unit would develop stealth, lateral thinking, and the ability to operate under physiological stress. The boys were expected to supplement their inadequate rations by stealing food from the farms, kitchens, and stores of the surrounding area. Critically, the rule was not that stealing was forbidden. The rule was that being seen was forbidden. If a boy was caught in the act of stealing, he was beaten, not for the theft, but for the incompetence of being detected. This distinction was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a direct training methodology for producing the kind of soldier who could conduct covert operations in hostile territory, who could move without detection, who could suppress the body's most basic signals of discomfort and need in the service of a mission objective. Leonidas learned to steal. He learned to starve. He learned that his body's suffering was irrelevant to the task at hand. The physical hardships compounded as the boys aged. From around 12 years old, each participant in the Agoge received a single cloak per year, one garment to endure the entirety of a Greek climate from the burning summers of the Peloponnese to the bitter winters of the Eurotas Valley. They went barefoot at all times, a practice that Plutarch identifies as deliberate toughening of the feet, but which also served a deeper purpose. It eliminated the concept of comfort as a relevant consideration. The boys slept communally, in the open air or in rough barracks. On beds they constructed themselves by pulling reeds by hand from the banks of the Eurotas River. There were no mattresses, no pillows, no concessions to rest. Every material condition of daily life was engineered to produce the same psychological result: the systematic extinction of any expectation that existence should be comfortable, easy, or kind. A Spartan soldier who reached the battlefield having spent 15 years conditioning his body to function without adequate food, warmth, or shelter was a soldier who would not break under the conditions of ancient warfare. He had already survived worse, every single day, since he was 7 years old. The most viscerally disturbing element of the entire Agoge was the ritual flogging conducted at the sanctuary of the goddess Artemis Orthia. This was not punishment for a specific offence. It was a scheduled ceremony, a rite of passage in which adolescent boys were systematically beaten before an assembled crowd of adult Spartans and, in later periods, Roman tourists who came to watch. The purpose was to train the body and the mind to endure extreme pain in total silence. A boy who cried out, who flinched visibly, who showed any outward sign that the pain was registering as distress, had failed. The ancient sources record that some boys died during these rituals, and that their deaths were considered an acceptable outcome. What was not acceptable was the display of weakness. The entire exercise was designed to sever the neurological connection between the experience of pain and the behavioral response of vulnerability, to produce a human being for whom suffering was simply a data point, not an emergency. Leonidas stood in that sanctuary. He endured what every other boy in his cohort endured, and if he made any sound, no one recorded it, because the ones who made sounds were not the ones who went on to command armies. By the time the boys reached the later phase of the Agoge, the young adult stage covering roughly ages 18 to 20, the system had one final use for its most capable graduates. The top performers, the boys judged most dangerous, most capable, and most psychologically hardened, were selected for the Krypteia. This institution, which we will examine in much greater detail in Act 3, was Sparta's mechanism for controlling its Helot population through organised covert murder. Young men operating in the Krypteia were sent out at night into the countryside, armed with daggers, with orders to kill Helots, specifically the strongest and most capable Helot men who might pose an organisational threat to Spartan authority. They were to operate in secret, to leave no witnesses, and to return without having been seen. The Krypteia was simultaneously a terror operation against the enslaved population and a final practical examination for the Agoge's graduating class. It merged the lessons of stealth, physical endurance, emotional detachment, and lethal execution that the entire preceding decade and a half had been building toward. Some scholars have framed the Krypteia as an initiation rite. In function, it was a murder program, and its graduates were the men Sparta trusted to stand in the front ranks of its armies. What emerged from 20 years inside this system was something that the word warrior does not fully capture. The Agoge did not produce men who were brave in the romantic sense, men who overcame fear through willpower and moral conviction. It produced men who had been so thoroughly conditioned that many of the emotional responses that would generate fear in a normal human being had simply been extinguished. They did not run toward danger because they were courageous in the way a poet might describe. They stood their ground because the system had spent 20 years making the experience of standing ground under extreme duress more familiar, more habitual, and more deeply wired into their nervous systems than any alternative behaviour. Paul Cartledge, one of the foremost modern scholars of Spartan history, has described the Agoge as a system of total psychological transformation, one that created not merely trained soldiers, but people whose entire identity, emotional range and value system had been fundamentally reconstructed by the state. They were, in a clinical sense, institutionalized, and the institution was war. For Leonidas specifically, the implications of having gone through the full Agoge were profound, and they distinguished him sharply from his half-brother Cleomenes in ways that would define the political dynamics of the Agiad house for the rest of their lives. Cleomenes, spared the system, grew up in a more conventional royal environment, present at court, exposed to political intrigue, educated in the affairs of statecraft, but never subjected to the physical and psychological grinding that the Agoge inflicted. The ancient sources describe Cleomenes as brilliant, erratic, politically ruthless, and ultimately unstable, a man whose genius bordered on madness. Leonidas, by contrast, emerged from the Agoge as something colder and more durable, a man who had been trained to suppress every impulse that might interfere with function. Where Cleomenes operated on instinct, passion, and political cunning, Leonidas operated on patience, discipline, and the quiet menace of someone who has been preparing for catastrophe his entire life and has no particular fear of it. These were two very different products of the same royal bloodline, shaped by radically different childhoods, and the collision between those two temperaments would eventually determine who sat on the throne of Sparta. The final thing to understand about the young Leonidas, the man who emerged from the Agoge somewhere in his early to mid-20s, is the specific psychological texture of what had been done to him. He had been separated from his family at 7 years old. He had been deliberately starved, beaten, frozen, and deprived of sleep for over a decade. He had been taught through every conceivable mechanism that his individual survival, comfort, and preferences were entirely subordinate to the needs of the state and the unit. He had participated in, or at minimum witnessed, the ritualized violence of the Krypteia. He had been conditioned to kill without hesitation, to operate in darkness, and to treat death, including his own, as an instrument rather than a catastrophe. And he had done all of this not as a common soldier's son, but as a royal prince who understood that he was unlikely ever to rule in a political household already charging with the tension of a contested succession. The man who would one day lead 300 soldiers to their calculated deaths at Thermopylae was not born at Thermopylae. He was made slowly and deliberately in the grinding machinery of the Agoge, and what that machine produced was not a hero in any sense that would comfort you. It produced something considerably more disturbing. The Agiad royal house of Sparta was not a family in any warm or functional sense of the word. It was a political institution, a dynastic mechanism designed to produce a ruling king and a succession of backups, operating under the permanent scrutiny of the 5 elected magistrates called the HEIRs, who held supervisory power over even the kings themselves. In theory, the system was orderly. The firstborn male heir inherited the Aegean kingship. The arrangement was sacrosanct and the state continued. In practice, the house that Leonidas was born into during the late 6th century BC was a pressure vessel of competing loyalties, contested legitimacies, and barely concealed ambition, one that had already been cracked by the bizarre dual-wife arrangement of his father Anaxandridas, and that was now building toward an explosion. Leonidas, standing third in a line of 4 brothers, had survived the Agoge, returned to Spartan civic life as a hardened and fully conditioned soldier, and settled into the only role his birth had assigned him. Distinguished warrior, royal spare, and quiet observer of a succession drama he had no apparent power to shape. The man standing between Leonidas and the throne was his half-brother Cleomenes I, and Cleomenes was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary figures in all of Spartan history. Ancient sources describe him in terms that historians have wrestled with ever since: brilliant, erratic, diplomatically masterful, militarily ruthless, and ultimately unhinged. Herodotus, who was the primary ancient source for the period, and who received much of his information about Cleomenes from people who were hostile to him, paints a portrait of a man not entirely of sound mind from the beginning, but a more careful reading of the same source reveals someone of genuine strategic genius. In 510 BC, Cleomenes marched into Athens and expelled the Pisistrated tyranny, an intervention that, almost by accident, created the conditions for Athenian democracy. In 494 BC, he led Sparta to one of its most crushing military victories in history at the Battle of Thermopylae, effectively annihilating the entire Argive army in a single engagement. He manipulated the oracle at Delphi, deposed a co-king, and ran a pan-Hellenic foreign policy with a complexity and foresight that most of his successors could never match. This was the man Leonidas watched from the shadows for years, but Cleomenes had a problem, and the problem was his own increasingly destabilizing behavior. As his reign progressed, the acts of political genius became harder to separate from acts of dangerous impulsivity. After engineering the deposition of the Eurypontid King Demaratus in 491 BC through a bribery scheme targeting the oracle at Delphi, Cleomenes found himself politically exposed when the plot was discovered. The Spartan authorities, led by the Ephors who had always maintained a wary oversight of his power, moved against him. Rather than face what amounted to a political trial that could result in his permanent disgrace, Cleomenes fled Sparta. He went first to the region of Arcadia, the mountainous heartland of the Peloponnese, home to dozens of small city-states that Sparta had kept divided and subjugated for generations through a deliberate policy of preventing their political unification. Cleomenes, in exile, began doing the one thing that terrified Sparta above all else. He started organizing the Arcadians, extracting oaths of loyalty, and building what looked very much like a private army loyal to him personally, rather than to the Spartan state. The threat Cleomenes now represented to Sparta cannot be overstated. A former king, one of the most militarily capable figures Sparta had produced in a generation, was assembling a coalition in the Spartan backyard, in a region where a united force could potentially march on Laconia itself. The timing was catastrophic. The Persian threat was gathering momentum. The Greek world was on the edge of its most dangerous crisis in living memory, and Sparta could not afford a civil war or an internal power struggle to coincide with the approach of Xerxes' armies. Faced with this reality, the Spartan authorities made a pragmatic decision that had the fingerprints of political calculation all over it. They recalled Cleomenes, offering to restore him to his kingship under the same conditions as before his departure. The message was essentially a controlled capitulation. Come back, submit to the institutions, and we will pretend the last few months did not happen. Cleomenes returned. What happened next is one of the most disturbing episodes in Spartan royal history, and its ambiguities are still debated by scholars today. Almost immediately after his return, Cleomenes began exhibiting behaviour that the ancient sources describe as unmistakable madness. According to Herodotus, he was going through the streets of Sparta striking every citizen he encountered in the face with his staff. His relatives, and here the ancient source uses a term that in context specifically includes his half-brothers, had him restrained, placed in chains, and confined under guard. The picture presented by Herodotus at this point is of a man who had completely lost his grip on reason. Raving, violent, erratic, alternating between moments of menace and something resembling frenzy. The guard assigned to watch him was a Helot, an enslaved man assigned to keep a Spartan king in chains, which was itself a measure of how far Cleomenes had fallen from any position of authority. At some point during his confinement, Cleomenes apparently convinced this guard to give him a knife. What followed was one of the most grotesque deaths recorded in Spartan royal history. The ancient sources describe him methodically cutting himself, starting at his shins, working upward through his thighs, into his belly, until he died from his wounds. The official Spartan verdict was suicide, the product of a mind destroyed by madness. Herodotus, to his credit, records at least 4 competing explanations for that madness that were circulating among the Greeks of his era, and none of them are particularly convincing on their own. The Spartans themselves claim the madness was the result of Cleomenes drinking undiluted wine, a practice he had allegedly picked up from Scythian ambassadors decades earlier, considered barbaric by Greek standards, because Greeks always diluted their wine with water. The Argives attributed it to divine punishment for his burning of their sacred grove after the Battle of Thermopylae. The Athenians blamed him for desecrating their sacred groves at Eleusis. Herodotus himself considered it retribution for the corruption of the Delphic oracle to bring down Demaratus. Modern scholars have found all of these explanations deeply unsatisfying, not because ancient Greeks were wrong to believe in divine retribution, but because the mechanics of the death do not read convincingly as suicide. A man experiencing a genuine psychotic break does not systematically carve himself from the feet upward with a blade in the manner described. The precision, the methodology, the progression of the wounds, these are details that have prompted serious academic attention. The historian David Harvey, in a detailed study titled Leonidas the Regicide, argued for the strong possibility of what the sequence of events implies, but what the ancient sources were careful never to state outright, that Cleomenes was murdered and that the most plausible suspect was Leonidas himself. Harvey's reasoning follows the evidence with uncomfortable logic. Cleomenes was imprisoned by his half-brothers, which means Leonidas was directly involved in his incarceration. Cleomenes was then guarded by a Helot who, by the hierarchical structure of Spartan society, was ultimately answerable to a Spartan master. The Helot gave Cleomenes a knife. Cleomenes died in a manner that was ruled suicide, but whose physical description strains credulity as a voluntary act. And immediately after Cleomenes' death, Leonidas, who was next in line, became king. The circumstantial chain is not proof, but it is a chain, and it fits together with the kind of cold, patient, functional logic that the Agoge had been specifically designed to produce in its graduates. Whether Leonidas directly ordered the Helot to give Cleomenes the knife, or whether other political actors in Sparta facilitated the death, the result was the same. A man who had survived the Agoge, who had spent his adult life studying power from the margins of the royal house, was now king. What Leonidas did immediately upon securing the throne reveals something important about the specific texture of his political intelligence. He married Gorgo, Cleomenes' own daughter, his half-niece. This was not a romantic arrangement in any modern sense. It was a consolidation move of precision, calibration. Gorgo was the blood heir of the previous Aegead king. By marrying her, Leonidas simultaneously neutralized the most obvious source of a legitimacy challenge, anyone who might claim that the Aegead succession had been violated, and absorbed that legitimacy directly into his own dynastic line. He was no longer just the third son of a dead king who had clawed his way to a throne through the death of his half-brother. He was now the husband of Cleomenes' heir, the custodian of the unbroken Aegead bloodline, and the unchallengeable occupant of the kingship. It was a masterstroke. It was also, structurally, the act of a man who understood power the way the Agoge had taught him to understand everything else, not as an abstraction, but as a practical problem with a practical solution, achievable through patience, positioning, and a willingness to operate in the dark. There is one final layer to the politics of this moment that history has largely smoothed over, and it deserves close attention. Herodotus, the principal ancient source for the life of both Cleomenes and Leonidas, obtained a significant portion of his information about Cleomenes from, by his own account, Gorgo herself. The woman who transmitted the official Spartan version of Cleomenes' madness and suicide to the historian, who would then preserve it for 2,500 years, was the daughter of the dead king, and the wife of the man who most benefited from his death. This is not a minor footnote. It means that the historical record of Cleomenes' final days was substantially shaped by the household of Leonidas, the very household with the greatest possible interest in the narrative of natural, madness-driven suicide rather than politically motivated murder. Paul Cartledge, the foremost modern scholar of Spartan history, notes that Cleomenes suffered what amounted to a damnatio memoriae, a systematic suppression of his legacy after his death, driven largely by the political interests of the Leonidas line. History, in this case, was not written by the victors so much as narrated by the widow of the man who killed the king. What Leonidas inherited when he took the Agiad throne was not simply a title. He inherited one of the most militarily powerful institutions in the Greek world, with all of its terrifying machinery intact. He inherited the permanent crisis of a slave state perpetually on the edge of internal revolt. He inherited a fractious political system in which 5 elected magistrates could overrule, exile, or impeach a king, and in which the other royal house, the Eurypontids, represented a permanent parallel power centre. And he inherited all of this at a moment of maximum external pressure, with Persian envoys already moving through the Greek world demanding earth and water as tokens of submission. The man who sat down on the Agiad throne in approximately 490 BC was not a hero riding into a story. He was a cold-eyed product of institutional violence who had watched his predecessor with great patience from the shadows and who had taken what he needed when the moment arrived. The myth wants you to imagine Leonidas as the man standing in the light at the pass of Thermopylae. To understand him fully, you need to spend more time in the dark years before that moment, in the snake pit of royal politics, in the prison where his half-brother died, and in the quiet, calculated transaction of a marriage that bound the bloodline of the dead king to the hands of the man most likely responsible for his death. We have just spent the last section inside the snake pit of Spartan royal politics, a world defined by surveillance, paranoia, and the terrifying awareness that the wrong people, knowing the wrong things about you, could end your life overnight. That dynamic did not die with ancient Sparta. Right now, your internet activity is being tracked, logged, and monetized by your ISP, by advertisers, and in many jurisdictions by government entities with full legal authority to access your data without telling you. The architecture is different. The principle is identical. NordVPN helps fix that. It encrypts your traffic, masks your IP address, and makes it much harder for your ISP, advertisers, and other third parties to track what you do online. With the full NordVPN app, you can protect your device connection across apps and background traffic, and one account supports up to 10 devices at the same time. It also operates under an independently audited no-logs policy and includes a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you want to check the current deal, go to the link in the description. Now, back to Sparta. When Leonidas ascended the Agiad throne around 490 BC, he did not inherit a kingdom in any conventional sense. He inherited a garrison. Sparta, the city, the surrounding territory of Laconia, and the vast conquered province of Messenia was not organized primarily around trade, culture, religion, or civic governance in the way that other Greek city-states were. It was organized around one overriding operational imperative: the permanent military suppression of the largest enslaved population in the ancient Greek world. Before we can understand what kind of king Leonidas was, before we can evaluate what his reign meant in practice, we must confront the foundational reality that made Spartan civilization possible and that shaped every single political and military decision a Spartan king ever made. Sparta was a society built entirely on a foundation of terror, and that terror had a specific human face: the Helots. The Helots were not slaves in the Roman sense, individual, property, bought and sold on a market, attached to a specific owner. They were something in some ways more brutal, a collectively enslaved people owned by the Spartan state as a whole, bound permanently to the agricultural land they worked and denied any legal standing whatsoever within Spartan society. They were the conquered remnants of two populations, the Laconians, who had been subjugated when Sparta first consolidated its power in the southern Peloponnese, and the Messenians, a neighbouring people whose conquest Sparta had completed in the 7th century BC after 2 generations of vicious warfare. The Messenian Helots, in particular, carried a deep cultural memory of a time when they had been free, when Messenia had been their own land, and when the men who now sent secret police to murder them in the night had been foreign invaders. That memory did not fade, it fermented, and that fermentation was the engine of Spartan paranoia for 3 centuries. Estimates of the ratio of Helots to Spartan citizens vary among ancient and modern sources, but all of them produce the same conclusion. The numbers were terrifying. Herodotus, writing about the time of the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, effectively the period immediately following Leonidas' death, records 7 Helots for every Spartan soldier. Modern historians examining the demographic and agricultural capacity of Laconia and Messenia have pushed that estimate considerably higher, with some credible scholarly reconstructions suggesting a ratio closer to 10, 15, or even 20 to 1 across the total population. This was not a minority population that could be managed through ordinary legal and social mechanisms. This was a numerical situation in which the Spartiate class, the full warrior citizens with their rights, privileges and military obligations, was a small, heavily armed, perpetually vigilant minority living in the middle of a vast and deeply resentful majority that could, if it ever, achieved organised collective action, simply overwhelm them by force of numbers. Every institution Sparta built, every practice it maintained, every custom it enshrined, including the Agoge itself, was downstream of this demographic reality. Sparta did not build soldiers because it loved war. It built soldiers because it was terrified of its own backyard. The formal mechanism through which Sparta managed this terror was one of the most extraordinary legal constructs in ancient history. Every autumn, without exception, the 5 Spartan HEIRs, the elected magistrates who exercised executive oversight over the entire state, formally declared war on the Helot population. This was not a metaphor. It was not rhetorical posturing. It was an official legal act carrying full religious and civic weight, which had one specific purpose: to permit the killing of Helots without the religious pollution that the ancient Greek world attached to the act of murder. Under ordinary Greek, religious law, killing a person without justification created a state of ritual contamination in the killer, a spiritual stain that required purification and that could bring divine punishment upon the killer's household and community. The annual declaration of war against the Helots neutralized that mechanism entirely. By legally classifying Helots as an enemy in a state of war, Sparta made their killing not merely legal but ritually clean. A Spartan who murdered a Helot in any given autumn was not a murderer in any religious, legal or social sense. He was a soldier operating in a war zone. This declaration was renewed every year, without exception, for centuries. Into this permanent state of declared war stepped the institution we first encountered in Act 1 as the final phase of the Agoge, the Krypteia. The men selected for the Krypteia were the most capable graduates of the training system. Young Spartiates in their early 20s, identified as possessing the highest combination of physical capability, psychological conditioning, and raw intelligence. They were sent out into the Helot-populated countryside of Laconia and Messenia with minimal equipment, a dagger, a small quantity of food, and instructions. During the day they hid, in ditches, under brush, in the shadows of rural terrain, invisible to the agricultural communities going about their daily work in the surrounding fields. At night they moved onto the roads and into the villages. Their mandate, as Plutarch records it directly from sources drawing on Aristotle, was to kill Helots, specifically to kill the strongest, most capable, most potentially dangerous Helot men, the ones who might serve as leaders, as organisers, as the nuclei around which resistance could crystallize. This was not random violence. It was a precision terror operation, targeting the human infrastructure of any potential rebellion before that rebellion could form. The psychological effect of the Krypteia on the Helot population extended far beyond the specific individuals who were killed. That was, in a sense, almost secondary to the deeper purpose. A population that knows it is being watched, that knows the strongest among them may disappear at any night without warning, that knows there is no appeal and no protection, and no record kept of the deaths, is a population that cannot organize, cannot plan, and cannot trust. The Krypteia killed people to send a message to the people it did not kill, and the message was simple and absolute. You have no safety here. The Helots lived under conditions that the historian Paul Cartledge has described as institutionalized terror, a permanent psychological state of siege in which the knowledge of potential murder at any moment was used as the primary tool of social control. They were not merely economically exploited. They were deliberately kept in a condition of fear designed to prevent the formation of collective identity, leadership, or the organizational capacity for resistance. And it worked, for centuries, with grotesque efficiency. The daily texture of Helot life under Spartan rule went beyond the nighttime terror of the Krypteia. It encompassed a comprehensive system of ritual degradation designed to reinforce, at every moment, the absolute gulf between Spartiate and Helot. The philosopher Myron of Preen, preserved in fragments, records that Helots were compelled to wear distinctive dress, a cap of dogskin and a garment of animal skins, that marked them visually at all times as members of a subject population. They were required to sing particular degrading songs and perform humiliating dances at social events, as public demonstration of their subjugation. At the Spartan communal dining institutions known as the Syssitia, the common messes where Spartiates ate together as part of the military community, Helots were brought in deliberately intoxicated on undiluted wine and displayed to Spartan boys as a lesson in what degradation looked like. The explicit pedagogical purpose, as Plutarch records, was to teach the next generation of Spartiates to despise drunkenness. But the mechanism was the public humiliation of human beings as educational props. These were not incidental cruelties. They were structural features of a system consciously designed to prevent Helots from ever developing the psychological resources for collective self-assertion. Leonidas, as king, was not a passive bystander to this system. He was its most senior custodian. The Spartan king's role was constitutionally multidimensional. He was simultaneously the head of the state religion, the commander-in-chief of the Spartan military when on campaign, and the chief executive authority of the city's political life. The ephors acted as a check on his power, and the Gerousia, the council of 28 elected elders plus the 2 kings, 30 members in total, provided the legislative framework, but within the field of military and security operations, the king's authority was direct and largely unchecked. The Krypteia operated under the ultimate authority of the Spartan state, which meant it operated under the ultimate authority of the institutions the king headed. When the ephors declared war on the Helots each autumn, they did so as part of a constitutional mechanism that the king was an integral part of. Leonidas did not merely tolerate the Krypteia. He was, by virtue of his office, its guarantor. The man who had himself likely participated in or supervised Krypteia operations as a young Agoge graduate was now, as king, the highest-ranking institutional authority over the entire terror apparatus that kept Sparta's enslaved majority in permanent subjugation. It is worth pausing here to consider what the passage of Leonidas through the streets of Sparta on a normal day in the 480s BC would have looked like to the people who saw him, to the Spartiates, the warrior citizens who had also passed through the Agoge, who ate at the same communal messes, who trained together and bled together. He was one of them, elevated to the highest position. To the perioikoi, the free non-citizen inhabitants of the surrounding towns, who had commercial and craft functions within the Spartan system but no political rights. He was simply the king, distant and powerful. But to the Helots who worked the fields of Laconia, who fed the Spartan messes with grain they had grown under compulsion, who watched their strongest neighbours disappear without explanation every autumn, to those people, Leonidas was not a man. He was the institutional embodiment of everything that held them in bondage. He was the face on the system that had declared legal war on them every year of their lives and every year of their parents' lives, and every year stretching back before living memory. To the Helot population of Laconia and Messenia, Leonidas was not a hero. He was the king of the people who could murder them without consequence. The final element of Leonidas's role as tyrant king that demands examination is the strategic military dimension of Helot control. Sparta's ability to project power outward, to fight in places like Thermopylae, to send armies north to resist Persian invasion, to maintain its position as the dominant military force in Greece, was entirely contingent on the security of the home front. The terrifying arithmetic of the situation was this. Every time Spartan soldiers marched away from Laconia, the ratio of armed Spartiates to Helots in the home territory shifted dramatically in the Helots' favour. This was not a theoretical concern. It was the most acutely practical military strategic problem Sparta faced on every single campaign. There is evidence in the ancient sources that Sparta was perpetually more cautious about deploying forces far from home than its military reputation would suggest, precisely because the leadership understood what an extended absence of the warrior class could mean for the enslaved population left behind. The Krypteia, the annual declaration of war, the ritual humiliations, all of it was not merely about suppressing the Helots today. It was about destroying their capacity for organised action so thoroughly that Sparta could afford to send its army away tomorrow. Leonidas, planning what we will examine in Act 4, understood this calculus with the precision that only a man raised from birth inside the system could possess. The march to Thermopylae was not just a response to Persia. It was an action taken by a king who had spent his entire life navigating the most dangerous military-political equation in the ancient Greek world, in a state that was always simultaneously fighting two wars at once, one at the frontier and one in its own fields. By the time Leonidas had been king of Sparta for roughly a decade, the world outside Laconia had been reshaping itself around a single, enormous gravitational force, the Persian Empire. The Achaemenid dynasty under Xerxes I had assembled the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen, and by 481 BC it was moving. The scope of the Persian mobilization was, even by conservative modern scholarly estimates, staggering. Herodotus gives figures in the millions, which modern historians have substantially revised downward, but even the most cautious academic reconstructions place the Persian invasion force at between 70,000 and 300,000 combat soldiers, supported by a naval fleet of somewhere between 600 and 1,200 warships. Xerxes had spent years preparing this expedition as his father Darius's unfinished business, a response to the humiliating Persian defeat at Marathon in 490 BC, where an Athenian-led force had driven a Persian amphibious landing back into the sea. The new invasion was not a punitive raid. It was a systematic, logistically planned conquest of the entire Greek peninsula, and the Greeks who were paying attention knew it. The Greek political response to this threat was, characteristically, fractured and deeply reluctant. Of the hundreds of city-states that made up the Greek world, only a small minority, approximately 31, agreed to form any kind of coordinated defensive alliance, the Hellenic League, which met in Congress at the Isthmus of Corinth in the autumn of 481 BC. The majority of Greek states either actively medized, that is, submitted to Persia and offered the traditional tokens of earth and water, or simply waited to see which way the wind would blow. Thebes, the most powerful city-state of central Greece, was visibly preparing to collaborate with the invader. Thessaly, the broad agricultural plain through which any Persian land advance would have to pass, had already accepted Persian suzerainty. The Greek alliance that faced Xerxes was, in practical terms, a coalition of the southern Greek states, primarily Sparta, Athens, Corinth, and their immediate allies, fighting not just against Persia, but against the demographic reality that most of their fellow Greeks were already on the other side, or had opted out entirely. This was not a unified civilization defending itself. It was a minority faction within a fragmented culture, making the best of a catastrophically bad strategic position. The military thinking that produced the plan for Thermopylae came primarily from the Athenian general and statesman Themistocles, who had been advocating for Athenian naval supremacy for over a decade and had finally secured the funding to build it just 3 years earlier, when a massive silver deposit was discovered at the Laurian mines. Themistocles understood a fundamental strategic reality that gave the outnumbered Greeks their only realistic path to survival. Xerxes' invasion depended on land and sea forces operating in coordination, and the supply and logistical coherence of a Persian army of that size required the fleet to remain close to the coast. If the Greek navy could contest Persian naval supremacy, it could threaten the Persian army's supply lines and ultimately force a strategic withdrawal. But the Greek navy needed time to get into position, time to find the right moment and the right terrain for a decisive naval engagement, and buying that time required the Persian army to be stopped, or at least slowed, by a blocking force on land. The strategic design that emerged from the Hellenic League Congress therefore had two simultaneous components: a land force to hold the pass at Thermopylae, the narrowest point on the main road between northern and southern Greece, and a naval force to contest the Straits of Artemisium to the north. The two operations were intended to be mutually reinforcing, a combined defensive posture that used Greece's most favourable terrain to negate Persian numerical superiority on both axes simultaneously. The choice of Thermopylae as the land blocking point was determined by geography, with a precision that modern military planners would recognise immediately. The pass was a coastal corridor squeezed between the mountains of central Greece and the Malian Gulf, and at its narrowest point, the middle gate, where the Phocians had built a defensive wall some years earlier, the usable fighting width was less than 20 yards. In a space that narrow, a Persian army of 150,000 men had no physical room to deploy its numerical advantage. 10 soldiers or 10,000 soldiers could only approach the defender in the same limited frontage. The tactical leverage this geography gave to a disciplined, heavily armoured phalanx of Greek hoplites was, in the right hands, decisive, provided the flanks could be secured. There was, however, one critical vulnerability. A mountain track called the Enopeia Path ran through the high ground parallel to the pass, and a force that knew of it and could traverse it, undetected, could descend behind the Greek position and encircle it. Leonidas was informed of this path by locals from the nearby city of Trachis almost immediately upon his arrival. He stationed a detachment of 1,000 Phocian troops on the heights to guard it. Whether he genuinely believed the Phocians would hold that position against a determined assault, or whether he understood from the beginning that they almost certainly would not, is a question the ancient sources do not definitively resolve, and the ambiguity is revealing in itself. Here is where the Carneia comes in, and why its role in the Thermopylae story is so frequently misunderstood. The Carneia was the most sacred festival in the Spartan religious calendar, a period of approximately 9 days dedicated to Apollo, during which military activity was strictly forbidden by Spartan religious law. In 480 BC, the Carneia coincided almost exactly with the period when Persian forces were advancing through Thessaly and into central Greece. This was not the first time the Carneia had constrained Spartan military action. At the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, the Spartans had arrived too late to participate precisely because the Carneia had prevented their early mobilization. The coincidence at Thermopylae was therefore both religiously genuine and politically convenient, and it requires careful handling. The 5 Ephors formally declared that the religious prohibition prevented the full Spartan army from marching to Thermopylae, and authorized instead an advance expedition under Leonidas, composed of 300 personally selected Spartiates, a number that mirrored the traditional size of the king's standing bodyguard, the Hippias, though Herodotus makes clear these men were specifically chosen for their age and experience, to proceed to the pass and hold it until the festival concluded and the main army could deploy. To dismiss the Carneia as a mere excuse, manufactured to avoid committing Spartan forces to an exposed forward position, overstates the case for pure cynicism. The Spartans took religious obligation with absolute seriousness, but it is equally true that religious obligation, in this specific instance, provided an institutional mechanism that conveniently limited the risk to the Spartan citizen body, while sending a symbolic force forward to maintain Sparta's credibility as the nominal military leader of the Greek alliance. The Olympic truce added a further layer of religious sensitivity to the situation. The Olympic Games were also being celebrated in 480 BC, and the Olympic truce was a pan-Hellenic religious institution centered on safeguarding travel to and from Olympia and protecting the sanctuary itself, rather than universally halting all Greek warfare during the Games. Sparta thus faced simultaneous religious obligations of the highest order, both of which pointed toward constraining the size of any force it could immediately send north. The result, as recorded by Herodotus, was an advance expedition rather than a main army deployment, framed publicly as a temporary measure pending the resolution of the festivals, with firm promises of massive reinforcement to follow. These promises were made to the other Greek allies who joined the force at Thermopylae. Whether Leonidas believed them himself, or whether he understood with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his life inside the Spartan political machine that the main army was never going to arrive in time, is another question the ancient sources approach but do not directly answer. The selection of the 300 men Leonidas took with him to Thermopylae is one of the most analysed decisions in ancient military history, and it contains a detail that almost every romantic retelling quietly omits. Herodotus records explicitly that Leonidas handpicked his Spartans and that the criterion for selection was that each man chosen must already have living sons. This is a fact of enormous significance, and its implications cut in two different directions simultaneously. The most common interpretation, offered by some ancient sources and many modern commentators, is that men with living heirs had fulfilled their primary obligation to the Spartan state, the production of future warriors, and could therefore be sacrificed without dynastic damage to their family lines. This reading frames the selection as a kind of cold utilitarian calculus. These men are already reproductively expendable. But the HistoryNet analysis drawing on Barry Strauss's scholarly work on Salamis offers a more militarily grounded alternative reading. That men in their 30s and 40s, who had sons and had survived the Agoge and served as soldiers long enough to father children, were simply the most experienced, most psychologically mature, and most reliably capable fighters available. The selection was not about expendability, it was about operational quality. These were not 300 men sent to die. They were 300 of the most dangerous human beings in the ancient world, sent to make the pass as expensive as possible, for as long as possible. And Leonidas knew them personally well enough to make that assessment about each one of them individually. The Delphic oracle had already issued its verdict before Leonidas marched. The oracle's prophecy, preserved in Herodotus, was unambiguous. Either Sparta would be sacked by the Persians, or one of her kings descended from the line of Heracles would die. There was no third option. Leonidas was descended from Heracles through the Aegeid line. The mythological pedigree that legitimized both royal houses was its direct connection to the Heracles legend. He knew the prophecy. His men knew the prophecy. The Greeks who sent them knew the prophecy. What the myth-making that followed Thermopylae transformed into a narrative of noble self-sacrifice was, at its political core, something considerably more calculated. A king who had been told by the most authoritative religious institution in the Greek world that his death was the price of his city's survival, marching to pay that price with the professional detachment of a man who had been conditioned since the age of 7 to treat his own death as an instrument of state policy. The Agoge had spent 20 years preparing Leonidas for exactly this transaction. He was not overcoming fear at Thermopylae. He was executing a contingency that had been latent in his conditioning since childhood. The broader strategic context of the mission must also be understood clearly, because the dominant modern narrative, that Thermopylae bought decisive time for the Greek navy to prepare for Salamis, has been significantly complicated by modern scholarly analysis. George Corkwell, the Oxford historian of the Persian Wars, has argued directly that the time between Thermopylae and Salamis was not primarily determined by the 3-day battle at the pass, but rather by Xerxes' own methodical pace, his systematic reduction of Phocian and Boeotian resistance, his occupation of the evacuated city of Athens, and the political and logistical preparations for the naval engagement. The gap between the fall of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis was approximately 1 month, and Corkwell suggests that Xerxes would have taken broadly the same amount of time to reach Salamis regardless of whether Thermopylae had been held for 3 days or 3 hours. This analysis does not diminish the courage of the defenders, but it does strip away the comfortable narrative in which 300 men's deaths can be directly credited with saving Greek civilization. The real function of Thermopylae was strategic and psychological, rather than purely temporal. It demonstrated to a fragmented, terrified, largely defeatist Greek coalition that Persian infantry could be, killed in large numbers by Greeks defending favourable terrain. It kept Sparta's credibility as the alliance's military leader intact, at a moment when its religious restrictions had prevented full deployment, and it provided the propaganda of martyrdom that Themistocles' political genius would leverage into the unity of purpose required for the fleet action at Salamis. What Leonidas almost certainly understood, with the cold, precise, deeply unsentimental intelligence that the Agoge and 20 years of political navigation had produced, was the full geometry of the transaction he was entering. He was not riding into a heroic last stand. He was executing a complex strategic operation that had a military component, a political component, a religious component, and a psychological component, and that required the sacrifice of 300 men, including himself as its terminal condition. The man who had navigated the snake pit of the Agiad royal house, who had patiently watched his half-brother fall, who had absorbed Gorgo's dynastic legitimacy through strategic marriage, who had spent decades overseeing the most efficient terror apparatus in the ancient Greek world. That man did not march to Thermopylae in a surge of romantic emotion. He marched there because the oracle had spoken, because the political logic was clear, because the military position was the best available, and because 20 years in the Agoge had made the prospect of his own death, in service of the state's survival, less frightening than any alternative. That is not a story about glory. That is a story about what happens when a society successfully produces the kind of human being it set out to produce. The Greeks arrived at Thermopylae in late August or early September of 480 BC, approximately 7,000 soldiers in total, drawn from across the Greek world. Spartans, Tegeans, Mantineans, Corinthians, Arcadians, Phocians, Thespians, and a contingent of Thebans whose loyalty to the Greek cause was, at best, ambiguous. Leonidas set up his command at the Middle Gate, the narrowest section of the pass, where the Phocians had constructed a defensive wall some years earlier to guard against Thessalian incursions. From this position, the pass was squeezed to a width that ancient sources describe as barely wide enough for a single chariot, though modern geological surveys suggest the effective fighting front was closer to 20 yards, still a frontage that rendered Persian numerical superiority tactically meaningless. Leonidas arrayed his forces behind the old Phocian wall, positioned the Phocian contingent of 1,000 men on the heights above to guard the Anapeia path, and then waited. Xerxes, having arrived with his army and surveyed the Greek position across the Malian Gulf, reportedly sat in his camp for 4 full days, waiting for the Greeks to lose their nerve and disperse. They did not. On the 5th day after his arrival, with his supply situation already beginning to show the first signs of strain, Xerxes sent his army into the pass. The first assault on the Greek position was led by the Medes and Scythians, some of the empire's most reliable and experienced troops, drawn from the heartland provinces of the Persian military machine. Herodotus records that the Persians went into the attack with the specific order to take the Greeks alive and bring them before Xerxes. What happened instead constituted one of the most one-sided infantry engagements in ancient military history. The Median and Scythian forces were systematically cut to pieces. Herodotus records that Xerxes leapt to his feet 3 times from his watching throne as he witnessed what was happening to his men in the pass. The physical mismatch between the two forces is important to understand clearly, because the movie version of this battle replaces it with aesthetic drama. Greek hoplites at Thermopylae were equipped with bronze breastplates, greaves, Corinthian helmets, large circular shields of layered wood and bronze called hopla, and spears measuring between 7 and 9 feet in length. Persian infantry were equipped with wicker or leather shields, lighter armour, shorter spears, and shorter swords. In the open terrain of Anatolia, or the broad plains of the Near East, Persian forces compensated for these individual equipment disadvantages through mass, cavalry, and missile fire. In a 20-yard wide pass, there was no room for mass, no room for cavalry, and the hoplite shields and helmets deflected most arrow fire effectively. The Persians walked into the killing corridor and died in it, in enormous numbers for 2 days. The hoplite phalanx itself demands description because the Hollywood version has replaced the grim reality of it with visual spectacle. A Greek phalanx was not a line of individual warriors engaging in personal combat. It was a machine, a rigid geometric formation in which men stood literally shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their large circular shields to create an unbroken wall, with spears projecting forward in layered rows above and between the shields. The men in the rear ranks pressed forward against the men in front, providing not just their own weapons but the physical momentum of their bodies as pushing weight against the enemy. The physics of it meant that a well-formed phalanx was nearly impossible to break from the front by any force that did not have equivalent armament and equivalent formation discipline, and in the narrowness of the middle gate, the Persians could never concentrate enough weight in their frontage to generate the pressure required to collapse it. The Spartans rotated their units in and out of the fighting line as men tired, which implied they had more than enough fighters to cover the frontage, even while resting segments of their force. They also, according to Herodotus, employed a devastating tactical feint, deliberately feigning retreat, drawing pursuing Persian units forward out of their own formation, then turning and cutting them down in the open. It was disciplined, systematic, and completely merciless. On the first day, Ctesias records that the initial Persian wave was cut to ribbons, with only 2 or 3 Spartans killed in exchange. Xerxes, understanding that his best troops were being consumed in the pass, unleashed his elite personal guard, the Immortals, 10,000 of the finest soldiers in the Persian Empire. They fared no better. By the end of the second day of fighting, the tactical situation at Thermopylae had settled into something that would have given a rational Persian commander cause for serious strategic concern. 2 full days of assault by some of the best units in the Persian army had produced enormous casualties and 0 forward progress. The supply situation for Xerxes' massive force, which required staggering quantities of food and water every single day just to maintain itself in place, was deteriorating. The Greeks were rotating fresh units into the line and showing no signs of exhaustion, demoralization, or breakdown. If this continued for several more days, Xerxes faced a scenario in which his campaign would stall, not because the Greeks defeated him militarily, but because his army could not sustain itself in static contact with a position it could not force. Then, on the evening of the second day, everything changed. A local man from the region of Trachis, his name was Ephialtes, and the Greek language subsequently turned his name into their word for nightmare, approached the Persian camp and requested an audience with Xerxes. He offered to guide a Persian force along the Anopia path, the mountain track running through the high ground parallel to the pass that Leonidas had stationed the Phocians to defend. Whether Ephialtes acted from greed, from grudge, from some private collaboration with the Persian cause, or from simple opportunism, the ancient sources do not fully explain. His name became the most reviled in all of Greek history. What he gave Xerxes that evening was the key that unlocked Thermopylae. Xerxes immediately dispatched his general Hydarnes, leading a force that Diodorus estimates at 20,000 men along the path after nightfall. They moved through the dark in silence, and they were moving since before dawn. The Phocians stationed on the heights above the pass heard them before they saw them, the sound of feet disturbing dry oak leaves in the pre-dawn darkness. Herodotus records that the Phocians leapt up in alarm and scrambled to arm themselves. Hydarnes, momentarily alarmed by the sight of armed men forming up in the dark, was reassured by Ephialtes that these were not Spartans. He had no interest in a fight that would delay his schedule. He simply ordered a volley of arrows against the Phocians, who retreated further up the hill to form their own defensive stand, and then he marched past them without further engagement, descending toward the eastern end of the pass, where he would close the trap on Leonidas from behind. The Phocians, to their lasting historical shame, let him go. Whether through fear, shock, or a failure of tactical nerve, They did not attempt to pursue, to delay, or to send a runner fast enough down the mountain to give Leonidas meaningful time to react. They simply watched the Persian column march away into the dark toward the men they had been specifically placed to protect. Leonidas received the news at dawn on the third day, carried to him by a runner from Trachis who had seen the Persian night march. He called a council of war immediately. The tactical situation was now as bad as it could be. The position was being enveloped from the rear. The main Persian force sat at the front of the pass ready to resume its assault, and the Phocians, who were supposed to prevent exactly this encirclement, had failed to do so. According to Herodotus, there was genuine debate among the Greek commanders about what to do next. Several Peloponnesian contingents argued for immediate withdrawal, a rational military response to encirclement that would have saved their armies to fight another day on ground of their own choosing. Leonidas listened to the arguments. Then he made his decision. The majority of the Greek allies were ordered to withdraw, and most of them went. The contingents from Corinth, Arcadia, Tegea, and the other allied states departed the pass, along with the Phocians who had already vacated their heights. What remained, at the final accounting, was the 300 Spartans, a force of 700 Thespians who refused to leave because their home city lay directly in the Persian line of march and they had nothing to return to, a contingent of 400 Thebans whose loyalty remained questionable throughout, and an uncertain number of Helots who had accompanied the Spartan force as personal attendants. The Thespians deserve more acknowledgement than history typically gives them. These were not warriors from the premier military power of Greece. They were soldiers from a middling Boeotian city-state who understood, with clear eyes, that if Persia overran central Greece, their homes would burn regardless of whether they stayed or fled, and who chose to stay anyway. Their general, Demophilus, led every single fighting man the city of Thespai could muster to Thermopylae, and every one of them died there. They receive one line in most retellings of the battle. They deserve considerably more. The Thebans, by contrast, behaved as their political ambiguity had predicted. When the final stand became unsurvivable, most of them moved away from the remaining. Defenders with their hands raised surrendered to the Persians and were taken prisoner. Xerxes had them branded with the Persian royal mark, a gesture of contempt that was also, in its own way, a mercy. The men who stayed on the hill received no mercy at all. The final battle was not a dramatic set piece, it was an extermination. Leonidas led his remaining force out of the narrow confines of the pass and into the slightly wider terrain beyond, in what Herodotus describes as a deliberate decision to kill as many Persians as possible in the remaining time before the encircling force arrived at their backs. The fighting was frontal, brutal, and at extremely close range. The Greeks fought with spears first, driving them into the advancing Persian mass until, as Herodotus records, every spear was shattered. They then drew their short swords and continued. Two of Xerxes' own brothers, Abracomes and Hyperanthes, died in this phase of the fighting. Leonidas himself was in the front of Self, the formation, leading from the point of maximum contact in the way that Spartan military culture demanded of its kings, and he died there. Herodotus says he was shot down by Persian archers, cut through by the arrow volleys that were now arriving in volume from both ends of the closing trap. He did not die in a noble single combat. He died in the grinding, screaming chaos of a melee that was already decided, shot from a distance by men he could not reach, doing exactly what he had been conditioned since the age of 7 years old to do, standing in front of the oncoming force and refusing to move. What happened to his body in the immediate aftermath is one of the most intense tactical episodes described in the entire Herodotian account of the battle. When Leonidas fell, both sides immediately recognized the significance of what had happened and fought over the corpse with extreme violence. The Greeks surged forward to recover his body and succeeded in pushing the Persians back 4 times before finally securing it and dragging it behind their lines to the hill where the last survivors were making their final stand. The value the Spartans placed on this recovery was not sentimental in any modern sense. It was a matter of cultural obligation. Spartan warriors did not leave their dead in enemy hands, and possibly also of deliberate political statement. Leonidas was the king. His body was the symbol. The fact that the remaining Greeks fought with the ferocity Herodotus describes to recover it, even in the last minutes of an already decided battle, is a measure of how absolutely the Agoge had conditioned these men's priorities. They were being killed from all directions. They stopped to collect their king. The final moments on Kolonos Hill, identified definitively in 1939 by archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, who found large concentrations of Persian bronze arrowheads there, were not a heroic tableau. They were a killing ground. Xerxes, having allowed the immortals sufficient time to descend the mountain path and close the encirclement, launched his frontal assault at dawn. The remaining Greeks, the shattered remnant of 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians and whatever Helots remained, were driven back onto the hill and surrounded. They were out of spears. Most were out of swords. Herodotus records the most terrible detail in his entire account of the battle, with almost clinical brevity. Those who still had swords used them, and the others resisted with their hands and teeth. They were buried under arrow fire. Xerxes ordered the hill surrounded completely, and instructed his archers to simply shoot into the position until nothing moved. Marinatos' arrowheads, scattered thickly across the hill's surface 25 centuries later, are the physical residue of that order. Xerxes walked through the aftermath of Thermopylae and viewed what remained. The pass was opened. The Greek strategy had failed. The Persian king had sustained significant casualties. Ancient sources inflated Greek claims of Persian dead to figures exceeding 20,000, which modern scholars consider exaggerated. But the losses were real, and they had cost him time, supplies, and the political dignity of watching his best troops fail for 2 full days. Xerxes was not magnanimous in victory. He was furious. The fury was disproportionate, and its target was not the living Greeks who had already fled. It was the dead king. According to Herodotus, Xerxes ordered that the body of Leonidas be beheaded and the head placed on a stake for public display. The historian notes explicitly that this violated the standard conventions of ancient warfare, that even in the brutality of the ancient world, there were norms surrounding the treatment of enemy dead, and that desecrating a defeated commander's corpse in this manner was considered an act of dishonour that reflected badly on the desecrator rather than the desecrated. Later, sources including an account preserved through Diodorus add crucifixion or impalement of the headless body. The corpse hung up as a public spectacle for the army to march past. Xerxes did not do this to every Greek who died at Thermopylae. He did it specifically to Leonidas. The personal nature of the desecration speaks to a rage that had nothing to do with normal military protocol. The man who had held the pass for 3 days killed 20,000 of his soldiers and made the King of Kings stand up 3 times from his throne in disbelief. That man required specific punishment, even after death. The irony of Xerxes' revenge is that it produced exactly the opposite of its intended effect. In the Greek world, the story of Thermopylae spread immediately, carried by the survivors of the Allied contingents who had retreated and lived to tell what they had seen. The narrative that took hold was not one of defeat. It was one of the most powerful propaganda tools any civilization had ever accidentally created. 300 men, led by their king, who had stood against an empire and made it bleed for 3 days. Simonides, the greatest lyric poet of the age, composed the epitaph that was cut into the stone monument at Thermopylae. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. 40 years after the battle, when the Persian threat had been repelled and Greece had resumed its fractious normalcy, the bones of Leonidas were exhumed from the site of the battle and carried back to Sparta with full honours. He was reburied in the city. A hero shrine was established in his memory. Funeral games were held every year in his name. The man Xerxes had beheaded and hung on a stake was now a demigod, his legacy immortalised in stone and ceremony across the Greek world. The man who had spent his entire life as a spare heir, who had survived the Agoge's grinding machinery, who had navigated a royal court soaked in paranoia and possible murder, who had ruled a terror state with cold institutional competence, That man had been transformed by his death into something no amount of careful political management during his life could ever have achieved. He had become a myth, and the myth was so powerful, so perfectly shaped to the human need for heroic sacrifice, that it swallowed the man completely. What we have spent the last 2 hours recovering is what was swallowed. Not a hero, a product, a weapon, a king, and a story that is, in every verifiable historical detail, far more disturbing and far more remarkable than the one they sold you in the cinema. We began this documentary with an image, a bronzed warrior in a crimson cape standing at the mouth of a pass, defiant against an empire. We promised to show you what was behind that image. We have now done that. What we found behind the myth of Leonidas was not a lesser man. In many ways it was a far more formidable one, but formidable in a sense that the myth could never capture, because the myth required a hero, and what history actually produced was something considerably more unsettling than heroism. Leonidas was born into a family defined by political tension and contested legitimacy, a spare heir in a royal house that had no use for spares. He was fed into the most psychologically destructive state training program the ancient world had ever designed, at an age when modern children are still in primary school, and he survived it, which means the system worked on him exactly as it was intended to. What emerged from the Agoge was not a man of admirable character in any comfortable moral sense. It was a man whose capacity for individual emotional life had been deliberately and systematically reduced in service of collective military function, who had been conditioned to treat pain, loss, and death, including his own, as operational data rather than personal catastrophe. He took a throne that most evidence suggests was cleared for him by the death of his half-brother, under circumstances that are, at minimum, deeply suspicious, and possibly constitute one of the most successful political murders in Spartan history. He cemented his power through a strategically calculated marriage that absorbed his predecessor's dynastic legitimacy into his own line. He then ruled, for approximately 10 years, as the head of a terror state whose economy was built entirely on the coerced labour of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, whom his government formally declared war on every single autumn, and whose strongest members were systematically hunted and killed by the same institution that had graduated him as a young man. At Thermopylae, he did not ride to glory on a wave of noble passion. He executed a military calculation that the evidence suggests he understood clearly, that the strategic situation required a blocking force, that the religious and political constraints of the Chroneia limited what Sparta could formally deploy, that the geography of the pass gave a small force maximum tactical leverage against an enormous one, and that the Delphic prophecy had already told him, with the full authority of the most trusted religious institution in the Greek world, what the price of the transaction was going to be. He paid it, without visible hesitation, without theatrical farewells recorded in the sources, without any of the speeches that Hollywood placed in his mouth centuries later. He simply marched and fought and died, exactly as he had been built to do. And Xerxes, furious, humiliated, determined to erase every trace of the man who had cost him 3 days and thousands of soldiers, cut off his head and hung his body on a stake. He intended to obliterate Leonidas from memory. Instead, he handed the Greeks the most powerful martyr narrative in the ancient world, one that would outlast his empire by 2.5 millennia, and is still being retold today in cinemas and on channels exactly like this one. The great irony of the story of Leonidas is that the beheading was Xerxes' greatest tactical mistake. He could not kill the myth. In trying to destroy the man, he created something far more durable than either of them. The real Leonidas was not the hero the myth requires. He was a product, a specific, deliberate, extraordinarily effective product of a society that had decided several centuries before his birth that it would build human beings the way other civilizations built walls, systematically, under extreme pressure, with no tolerance for weakness, and the product they built in Leonidas was precisely what they designed it to be. A man who could stand in a narrow pass at the end of the world, surrounded by the largest army ever assembled, and feel nothing that would make him step aside. That is not glory. That is engineering. And it is, When you understand what went into making it, one of the most terrifying things in all of human history, if you made it to the end of this documentary, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. 2 hours of unfiltered, unromanticized history. No fairy tales, no comfortable mythology, just the brutal, documented truth of what actually happened and why it matters. That is what Wars in History does on every single video we publish. If this documentary changed how you think about Thermopylae, about Sparta, or about the way history gets turned into myth to serve the needs of the present, share it. Put it in front of someone who thinks they already know this story. Because the conversation that happens when someone realizes the history they were taught was a carefully constructed narrative, that conversation is worth having. And if you want to go deeper into the world we have been exploring tonight, there are 2 videos I want to put directly in front of you right now. The first is our full documentary on the Persian Wars, the complete story of Salamis, Plataea, and the campaigns that determined whether Greek civilization would survive at all, told with the same commitment to historical accuracy you have seen tonight. The second is our documentary on the full reality of the Spartan military system, what it actually produced, what it cost, and why the civilization that built it ultimately collapsed from within. Both are on screen right now. Click either one and we will keep going. The history is not finished yet. It never is.